by the
Sertima of Rutgers University, the author of the book, They Came Before Columbus. Welcome.
Good to be here, Gil.
Now, there's been a lot of discussion lately about Mr. Columbus and what he did and what he did not do. But your research that you've expounded on in previous programs as years gone by, your thesis is older, that our presence in this hemisphere preceded the enslavement period, that there was another period where Africans came. Tell me a little bit more about that and how it pertains to this discussion of Mr. Columbus nowadays.
Well, the first thing that we have to understand is that to assume that Columbus was the first to make contact with the Native Americans is something that does not take account of any of the evidence, including the evidence of Columbus himself. Columbus was the first person to suggest there were Africans in America before him. He actually says in the journal of his second voyage that when he was in Haiti, the Native Americans there told him that black-skinned people had come in large boats from the south and southeast trading in gold-tipped metal spears. Columbus actually sent back samples of these gold-tipped metal spears back to Spain. They were assayed, they were inspected by metallurgists in Spain, and the Spanish metallurgists showed that they were identical with spears being forged in African Guinea. Of 32 parts, 18 were of gold, 6 of silver, and 8 of copper, just like the spears in the Caribbean. The words that were used by the people in the Caribbean that Columbus met in Haiti were identical with the words used in Africa all along the Atlantic coast, a range of words used for these spears.
Are there a lot of writings from Mr. Columbus, by Mr. Columbus, that survive? How do you know that he wrote?
Oh, yes. Columbus made up a lot of things, but he wrote quite a lot. I mean, he made up a lot about his background, even his name, etc. But there is no question that he wrote he had at least 4 of his 4 major voyages. He left quite a lot of papers. There's a book published in this country in 1903, 2,114 pages, just on the surviving writings of Columbus, diaries of Columbus, things said about Columbus in connection with these diaries.
Well, before we get into the era that preceded him, let's talk a little bit about Mr. Columbus. Who was he? Was he an Italian? And what was his name?
There's a question about Columbus. I have not gone very much into his identity because I know he made up so many things. There's a lot of confusion about that. A book by Frederick Paul, The New Columbus, suggests that he was the bastard son of someone called Colon. His name was Cristobal Colon, and that he took the name Cristoforo Colombo from a dead sailor because he'd been involved in some battle that opposed the Spanish sovereigns, and he needed them at a certain time, and he didn't want them to know about it, so he took on a different identity. There are lots of stories told about him.
So that would suggest he was Spanish. Colon?
Yes. He wasn't Italian, but I don't want to say he was Spanish because I'm making it quite clear there's a lot of confusion about his identity. And I have not been very much involved in that because my great concern has been to show that most people who are opposed to this thesis of an African connection with America are opposed because they assume that Europe was an advance, always an advance of other peoples, and that the reason why Columbus could sail and make contact first was because of the advance in their shipping. What we know now in 12 disciplines. Columbus, by the way, was not the only person to note these blacks. There are at least a dozen Europeans who noted them in that within the first 50 and 100 years, seeing them in places where they had not been. There's a whole range of them. Peter Martyr, Vasco Nuñez de Balbo in 1513, finding blacks among the Native Americans. And he actually asked these people, where did these blacks come from? And they said, we don't know, but they're a large settlement nearby.
Just a bit more about Mr. Columbus because there's so much discussion. To the best of your knowledge, what was the premise of his voyage? Was it exploration or was it exploitation?
What Columbus hoped to achieve, you see, is that a lot of excitement had developed in Europe about the voyages of Marco Polo. about the riches of India, etc. And to get a route to the rich Indies would be a great achievement. But he assumed that because the world was wrong, and that was not his idea. The Moors had made that quite clear, that the world was wrong, and that if you go far to the west, you end up in the east. He assumed that you could go to the west and end up in India. And he was so convinced of that, that although he landed on the edge, on the little islands on the edge of America, he did not know it was a new continent. He assumed he was off the edge of Asia. Even if he had doubts, he sent his notary, Fernando Perez de Luna, among the ships and made every man sign a document he was off the coast of Asia. And he threatened his men. If they were common sailors and they would to go back home and say that they had not been off Asia, they would be whipped, and they would have their tongues cut out. And if there were officers, they would be fined 500 maravedis. We do not know exactly what 500 maravedis was at that time, but it must have been quite a punishment. So Columbus had to convince the Spanish that he had got to the Indies. And however, something happened which he did not expect. They were discussing a demarcation line with Portugal, because Portugal insisted that they should have a line drawn at the westernmost edge of the Cape Verde Islands, just off Africa, and that 375 leagues should be theirs. And this line, in fact, included Brazil. I have a map of Brazil in 1448. This is more than half a century before Columbus. A map that was drawn on knowledge gained from the Moors. This is known as the Andrea Bianco map. So that, you see, the whole approach was that here we are, this is a great adventure, this is for wealth, etc. To hell with the people. I mean, the people were treated in the most awesome manner. Hands were cut off if they didn't pay the tax. I mean, the most incredible massacres. And Columbus was the first person to actually initiate slavery, because he actually took half a dozen Native Americans with him back to Spain. And people are under the assumption, oh, these natives, they were so stupid, they thought the whites were gods. That is not the case. He left a fort in the Caribbean after his first voyage, and every man in that fort was slaughtered when the natives realized that that these people were vulnerable. There are all sorts of things in that situation, but Columbus was absolutely heartless when it came to dealing with the natives. Even when they were kind to him, and he recorded in his diaries how generous these people were, he was so determined. The profit motive was so great, he was so greedy, that it didn't really matter. I mean, people became nothing.